Thank you everybody for logging in to our webinar today. Our topic today is on the next crisis is coming. Are you prepared? Lessons in supply risk management. This whole topic of risk, it is something that in the procurement and supply management circles we've been talking about now for, gosh, well over a decade. I mean, certainly longer than that, but in earnest. I remember a lot of the talk really starting in the late 2000s with the Great Recession, and certainly over the last 15 months or so, it's been a massive, massive topic for everybody in the space and beyond, quite frankly. But particularly relevant, particularly prominent since the pandemic. So we thought it'd be a good time now with us beginning to move, I'll say this very carefully, move out of the pandemic, but let's say towards hopefully the later stages of the pandemic. That we, and thank you, Steve, that we maybe take a moment and get some expert opinions, practitioner opinions on some of what we've experienced over the last year, how that's changed our perspective on this topic of risk and supply risk specifically. And what are some of the takeaways for all of us as practitioners and as we move forward into not only the rest of this year, but on into 2022 and beyond. So that's the goal. Our conversation today is going to be structured in 5 broad parts. We're gonna start off with, I'll do an introduction of the panelists in just a second, but we're gonna start off with setting the context, and I'll ask our panelists what their takeaways were over the last year, whether it's changed their perspective on risk. We'll talk a little bit about lessons learned over the last year, things that we should do and things that we should not do. We'll talk about prerequisites for supply risk management. And then we'll close out by talking about how we best prepare for future crises, given that this was a pretty big one. And then what are the implications for procurement post-crisis as well. So that's the broad structure. We're gonna keep this pretty relaxed, pretty fluid in terms of a conversation. The goal is really to learn from folks and share the lessons of Graham, Scott, and Steve. And with that, let me kick off with just the introductions. So we have 3 panelists who are joining us today. We have Scott Wilkerson, who is the Chief Procurement Officer and Global Lead for Transformation for Bonduelle Fresh Americas. We have, and I'll let each of you introduce yourselves in a second as well. Steve Liston, who is the VP of Global Procurement for Moderna. And then Graham, who is, everybody knows Graham, who is the Crochet, who is the Global Services Director at CASME. So let me stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand it over to each of you to do your introduction. So maybe Scott, if you could kick us off.
Great, good day everyone. Thank you, Omer, very much. So I'm really excited to be part of this today. Again, my name is Scott Wilkerson with Bonduelle Fresh Americas. I'm dialing in today from sunny Southern California, the land of earthquakes and fires. So I'm excited for this topic. Just a little bit around Bonduelle. So we are a family business that was established in 1853. And our mission is to inspire the transition to plant-based food because of some of the crises that face us around the world. We're in over 100 countries and we manage over 300,000 acres of food. Here in the US, our business is very focused on fresh salads, meal solutions, and vegetables. And some of our brands that you would know are Ready Pack Foods, Bistro, and we work with every major retailer and food service provider in the country. But I'm excited to be here.
Thanks. Steve?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Steve Liston. I'm the head of procurement at Moderna. About 18 months ago, many people wouldn't have ever heard of Moderna, but now I don't think I need to introduce the company. I've been the head of procurement there now for a couple of years. I was previously chief procurement officer at Shire Pharmaceuticals and Novartis Vaccines and Diagnostics. I have 25 plus years of procurement experience, but in all of it's been in the biopharmaceutical industry. So great to be here.
Great, thanks very much. Graham?
And hi everyone, my name's Graham Crochet. I'm the Services Director at CASME. CASME, that networking organization that brings procurement professionals together to have conversations on different indirect procurement categories. So I also have been in procurement all of my career, spent a lot of it in the music industry, both indirect and direct materials. So yeah, delighted to be here to talk about this very hot topic. Omar, thanks.
Yeah, thanks to all three of you. And you know, the way I like to sort of say it is, if you fed yourself healthily over the last year, if you saved yourselves by taking the vaccine, or if you educated yourself around these issues of risk and procurement, these are the gentlemen to get to know. So thank you all for everything that you've done over the last year in this context. So let's kick off our conversation. Maybe we can start off by just setting a little bit of context. It'd be good to get your personal perspectives on just the last year. How have I guess, maybe if you could share some thoughts and ideas or examples in terms of how you've responded, each of you responded to the crisis and the related risks that it presents. And then how's that changed your perspectives on supply risk as this issue that we grapple with within procurement circles? So maybe Scott, if you could maybe kick us off with your thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll start out by saying I did not have gray hair a year and a half ago. So that, and maybe, you know, as we think about risk, how things have changed, you know, I think we all tend to think about COVID because it's top of mind. But if we think about what's happened between what's happened in malware for many companies around the world, weather impact, volatility impacting the ability to move goods, transport, to grow, inflation that's profound. And so it's really transformed our obligation to think about the full end-to-end network and our ability to react and respond. And, you know, I think that some of us think in this context of sense and respond. And I think we need to add anticipate in a way that we've never looked at that before. And so I think our roles have transformed into being extraordinarily critical for sustaining our business and also the safety of our employees and the entire supply network, because we can't be successful if our supply network is not successful.
Yeah, that's a great point. And particularly, you're right, it's not just about sensing and responding, but whatever we can do to anticipate. And good shout out, which is, you know, we are so focused on the COVID issue that there's actually been other areas, cybersecurity being one of the biggest ones, and of course inflation, which is pending right now. Steve, your perspectives there?
Yeah, you know, I would say, you know, thinking about supply risk, it's definitely been elevated to the highest level that I've experienced in my career, you know, especially over the last 18 months. I mean, it was always a priority, but, you know, we were always, you know, competing with value delivery or supplier diversity or supplier performance, sustainability, some of these other things. And just within the last year, the last, you know, 18 months, I think it's gone to the #1 priority. You know, we were, as many of the people on the call know, we were one of the first companies to get emergency use approval for our vaccine. And Moderna was a company that never had an approved product before. So we basically went from never making anything to then thinking, okay, well, if this product is approved, we're going to have to literally make hundreds of millions of doses. And on top of that, this is a new medicine. This is a messenger RNA product. It's never been made at scale in the world before, right? So thinking that, okay, if this was successful, we really need to think about our supply chain. We really need to think about what's coming at us and basically do our best to predict that and manage the risk of that to make sure that we're able to make that product, grow our factories, make that product, and ensure supply. So it's been extremely critical for us. And, you know, as many of the folks on the call know, it actually has panned out where, you know, we are one of the handful of products that are approved right now. And we've had to go up that chain of scaling our operation and making sure that we're able to make the product and manage the risk that's inherent with that has been extremely critical for us.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, it's I think we all face pressures in our own ways, and that's a whole other level of pressure in terms of making sure when we say the product has to get delivered, Steve, I mean, that's got to be a whole other level of pressure to grapple with.
Omar, I would say like we all felt like we were on a mission, right?
Yeah.
Once we found out that, okay, it seems like it works, right? The whole company was just, we've been on this mission, and everybody just felt like we took on that responsibility. And so all the normal work rules in a way went away for, and I would say there's still a way, because we still continue to scale making it. But it's really a team effort across the company, and everybody just felt so engaged in making sure that it was a success.
Yeah, I want to come back to that point that you made around work rules went away, because I think that's actually one of the, at least from what I've observed, one of the most important outcomes is probably the wrong word, the takeaways from a process perspective over the last 12 months. But we will come back to that. Graham, you speak to a lot of folks as part of what you do at CASME, and you get a lot of visibility into what practitioners across the world are doing. What have you sort of seen? What have you heard about this issue, and how has that changed people's perspective?
I think the first thing to say, and in fact, I think it's something you and I have chatted about not that long ago, I would actually say that the pandemic itself has been good for procurement. I know it's a strange thing to say, but if you think about it, the procurement, the word, the press coverage, the conversations going on at all different levels, and I think risk has actually been the number one element, the one topic that has generated so much of that conversation. But you've now got it that procurement is listened to by not only stakeholders, but much more sort of senior leadership within companies. And so we're actually riding on the back of some great success. But I think the challenge, and it's interesting to hear the risks, what I'm hearing is the breadth of what is covered within risk is the challenge, because so many more risks. And as it was sort of mentioned, there are so many that it's like, where do you start and where do you stop? But it's right that procurement is heavily involved with coming up with a solution. But I see it now as it might be towards the end of the pandemic, but this is the start. Procurement needs to ride on the back of the internal success that we've had, and now make even more change, add more value. So it's an exciting time to be in procurement, and great that risk is firmly on the agenda.
Great points, and I agree. I think that aspect of visibility, by the way, you're going to hear sirens. I'm in downtown Chicago. This is what tells you this is live and not pre-recorded, because you wouldn't have sirens if it was pre-recorded. So part of living in a big city, but hopefully we won't get too much of that. But no, I think that's right. I think, it's interesting because back in 2009, I've said this so many times in the past, but back in 2009, when we had the Great Recession, risk was considered to be a big topic. And it was an important topic. It was elevated. And I thought, that's the biggest crisis we're ever going to see in our lifetimes. And lo and behold, that wasn't the biggest crisis we would ever see. And what that's done is it's only elevated the visibility and importance of procurement, and the impact that the C-suite now realizes that procurement can deliver across the board. I think there were folks who had recognized that all along, but now it's sort of a greater lens. But no, I think a lot of those points around not only sensing and responding, but anticipating, the elevated visibility, the breadth of risks, I think those are critical points. With that, let me open it up. Andrew, if we could put up the first polling question. We'd love to get everybody's perspectives and feedback. The first polling question is, what are the top 2 risks that your organization faces today? And the options you'll see are financial stability of your strategic suppliers, supply chain continuity, cybersecurity, sustainability, diversity, equity and inclusion, corporate reputation risk. Please pick 2, any 2 of these, and we'll give everybody, I guess, 30, 40 seconds to enter their responses, and then we'll take a look at the results.
And actually only selecting 2 means you've got to think, because otherwise it'd be easy to tick all of these. Just the 2 that are the most significant, which are definitely, we want people to think, whether it's early morning or afternoon for you. It's, You could rely on Omer to make us work.
Graham, you're absolutely right. I would suggest we add all the above as an option. On that.
Oh, that would be too easy. You don't
would be
get
too
away with
easy.
that.
All right, Andrew, how are we looking? Oh, there we go. So supply chain continuity, that's been the biggest one. 83% of respondents said that was number one. Coming in, oh, we have a close tie for a second between financial stability of strategic suppliers, cybersecurity, and sustainability being the next couple of ones. I think that broadly makes sense. I think, I know in the midst of COVID, I know we're still in the midst of COVID, but broadly speaking, in the midst of most of last year, we were dealing with supply chain continuity and making sure that that the product was delivered. And clearly, folks are still grappling with that, or the ramifications of that, the residual aspects of that. So thanks everybody. That's great input. That's great perspective. And I think it aligns that we still got sort of a variety of opinions there in terms of just the breadth of risk that we've got. So with that, with having discussed kind of the context, or rather the what's happened over the last year, what would each of you say are the 2 to 3 biggest lessons? And I want to split this up in 2 ways. So feel free to sort of split your answers accordingly. What are the 2 or 3, let's just say 2 biggest lessons that you and your team learned about what you need to do to respond? And what are 1 or 2 things that you realize, you know what, we should not be doing that. We should not be focused on those things. So Steve, I'd ask you to kick off and provide your perspective there.
Sure. I think for lessons learned, probably at the top of the list would be really understanding your supply chain, right? What are you buying? Who are those suppliers? What are their sub-suppliers? What does that network look like? And what does that risk look like? Also, you can kind of take it to the next step and think about, okay, well, for those suppliers and the things that they're providing, what are your backups for if there was a disruption from any of those suppliers? So I think there's really important to understand what you're buying in your supply chain. The next thing would be for us, and this is one of the things that we still struggle with, is what does your future buying demand look like? What are you going to be purchasing in the future? At Moderna, we started out thinking, okay, well, maybe if the product gets approved, there's going to be 15 other vaccines and we might make a couple 100 million doses. And our demand for the product has continued to grow. And now we came out and publicly said next year, we want to be ready to make 3 billion doses. So the volume of materials that we're thinking about buying has really skyrocketed, and being able to understand what does that demand plan look like? And then how can you work with your suppliers to ensure that they're able to fulfill that demand plan? I think that's extremely critical. And then I think the third thing is just being ready to have your team ready to respond to issues as they come up, because stuff happens, right? There are suppliers that have this happen to them or that, and it's an extremely dynamic environment right now. And having a team that's okay with that volatility and has the skills to handle, okay, when things come up, working with suppliers to find solutions, maybe having a network to reach out to figure out, okay, well, what are our alternatives to sort of get around this problem that just immediately came up? I think that's really, really important. Things not to do, I would say, in these times, we don't need to go through a 7-step sourcing process, right? There's a need for us to make quick decisions, and as procurement professionals, we need to be okay with thinking about the pros and cons of the situation and being able to recommend quick decisions. And I think that's extremely critical. And I know that cuts against the grain of maybe some, including myself, of the standard process of kind of taking the time and really, but we don't have time right now. Right. And we need to have that flexibility. So I would say just being okay with, making quick decisions.
Yeah. And that goes back to that point that you made at the outset around work rules went away, and how we have to, I hate to throw in a buzzword, right? Be agile and really be able to respond to it. The other interesting thing that you're grappling with as well is is in terms of demand planning and expectations, it's not a 5% difference in terms of demand expectations or even a 25%. It's orders of magnitude more in terms of what you've had to grapple with. So those are certainly interesting challenges. Yeah. Scott, your thoughts, perspectives?
Yeah, Steve, those are all great points. And maybe just to build on that, I think it's easy for us. The first thing I'd start out with is what we need to do is understand the risks to our suppliers and our supply chain. So as I've thought about this, we tend to focus on what risk we will endure, but we're really the recipient of the risks of what our supply chain endures. And it's forced a different view for, I think, us and others in terms of really understanding that when a butterfly flaps its wings, what is the residual impact through everything? And I think that what we've experienced through the course of this is, our supply base unaware of the risk that they would endure through some of these experiences. And so that would be one. I think what we need to do also is, and I joke, but not, because in the world of earthquake country here in California, we have always spent significant amount of time in earthquake preparedness and planning. And it's we have an obligation, I think all of us, it's conference room crisis management. It's scenario planning. Let's act as though something happens. Let's work through every part of the scenario. How will we activate? Where will we work? How will information be shared? How do we receive product? And I think that that's something that we have an obligation to do. And again, it's in the context if we have supplier failure through the course of that. I think in terms of what not to do, I'll just say maybe one thing on this is that it's not an us versus them in any part of managing through these crises. It's all of us together and being responsive, respectful, working in collaboration with the entire supply chain to manage through. And so it's not about winning. It's about we all have to make it through this together. And and I will say, as one point on this is that we'll hear in different forums that we're kind of over the hump on COVID. I think the challenges we're facing right now in the supply chain for many companies are far worse now than they were during COVID, because now you have really breakdowns across various parts of the supply chain as it ramps up, and there's an inability to respond and struggles in every industry with access to labor. And so we're seeing this show up in extraordinarily unique ways. And so, I think of the sign mission accomplished. We have a ways to go, and for all of us, I think, before we're through this.
Yeah, those are great points on all of those, and clearly some resonating themes between what Scott, you said, and what Steve said, particularly around the conference room crisis management, right? And that it gets to that point of agility and being able to sort of get together and figure it out. And certainly, you're right about all of us being together. That's really, I mean, I think I have always expected it, but it was good to see it in practice over the last year in terms of how everyone came together, and not only within organizations, but across organizations, and having those conversations for the most part in terms of how do we work together? How we're all dealing with this. We're all facing our own constraints, but how do we all come together? And I'll just give a personal example. As many of you know, we've got a pretty sizable team in India, and COVID has ravaged India, for lack of a better term, but probably an accurate term, over the last several months. And the way our community, clients and suppliers and partners have come together to support each other and help us, frankly, in that time has been fantastic. So I think it's one of the sort of more positive, enduring takeaways of the pandemic and kind of what's come out of there. Graham, does that resonate in terms of what you're hearing in terms of this aspect around community and all of us being together and getting things done, the awareness of the supply base, the visibility, the agility aspects, et cetera? How does that resonate with kind of what you've been hearing in the CASME community and your own personal thoughts around that?
Yeah, very consistent. I mean, no surprise. They're consistent around the world. I mean, I think you're right. This procurement seems to have been working together much closer in the last year or so than ever before. And interesting, when we did some benchmarking looking at like the hot topics in procurement, for the first time ever, it was consistent. Whether you were looking at the Middle East, APAC, Latin America, it's almost through video conferencing, we've all been communicating. So in fact, my point in response to what Scott was saying is, to me, communication is so key to all of this. I know it's a bit blasé to say, but really it is so important. And I think the other point I'd like to share is what we've seen an awful lot of is, building on your comment, Scott, that actually suppliers themselves are de-risking their businesses. And so from a procurement point of view, you've actually got to take that on board, because it could well be that they're going to de-risk and not be as keen to be supplying you. Now, we know there are categories where that balance of power between buyer and supplier is more in the supplier's favor. So taking a step back and asking, actually, does the supplier want to supply me, is something I'd encourage every procurement professional to do. Don't assume just because you spend a lot of money or because you're a large, well-known company that suppliers will want to supply to you. It must be assessed.
Yeah, I think this issue of allocation in particular in that context has really been a big one over the last year. And that's kind of, you know, speaking of cliches, we talk about customer of choice and vendor of choice and all of those things on both vendor and customer of choice, to use both those. That's really come to the fore. I think we've now found out if we really are one or the other, right? And when we talk about partnerships, whether there's a real partnership there. So I think fair point's foundational. On that point of foundational, what would each of you say, and Graham, maybe if you could kick us off with kind of what you're seeing in terms of feedback of what are the prerequisites for effective supply risk management, right? What do you see as the necessary attributes, the capabilities or traits required to effectively manage supply risk? And I'd like to break this up into a couple of parts, right? So one is just, it could be process technology, et cetera. And then the other aspect, which I want to separate out, is the people aspect, right? Maybe Graham, if you can maybe kick us off, what are you hearing around
well, certainly let me talk to the technology first, because this is where there is the biggest area of frustration. And I have no idea who we've got listening to this, but the feedback I get from many companies is that the large ERP systems, without mentioning any of them, are so frustrating from a not only risk, but also for some of the other functions of procurement, but looking focus on risk, that it isn't good enough, quite frankly. And there are new companies setting up that are establishing themselves as being able to, whether it's trawl the internet, use big data, use algorithms to really work out the risk measures. But even with those, often those companies are very small and would actually fail your own due diligence process. But even if they are solid companies, there's still the frustration then of almost overload information. Yeah. So that the technology, we've still got a lot to do. But fortunately, there are companies now that are focused and know that that is required. I think then in terms of the people, you're back to the great procurement skills that people need, that soft skills, that ability to interpret, because I still come back to the point of it's all about communication, your ability to act as the interface between the supplier and your stakeholders. And you need the right language to be able to manage that and work out what's working and what's a challenge.
Yeah.
Steve, does that resonate? With what you...
Absolutely. Yeah, all of that. I think, the team having the skills to deal with critical issues like we talked about, being nimble and those softer skills. I think the technology discussion resonates a lot with me. The thing that I was thinking about as you were saying that, Graham, was just, I think what we've been trying to do to get around that is just really trying to understand our categories. And maybe it comes back to category management, understanding, having category managers that understand what's our strategy for that category? Who are those suppliers? How risky are those suppliers? What's our strategy? Should we, do we have one big supplier or should we have two or three, right? And I think we're and I would say maybe in general across industries, we're moving towards that 2 or 3 instead of having 1, maybe because of what's going on right now, right? I think that there's more of an openness to say, okay, well, leveraging scale with 1 isn't all it is, all it used to be, right? We need to think about that other option of making sure that we have alternatives. And it's okay for us maybe not to be perfectly leveraging scale in every spot for everything across all categories.
Yeah.
So those would be other things that would come up for me, Omer.
Yeah. So it's certainly maybe a broadening, I don't want to say redefinition, of this idea of total cost versus unit cost. And that encompasses some of the more qualitative aspects of supplier alternatives, redundancy, to use that term very carefully, but security and safety, right?
That's right. That's right. I think it becomes a more important component in category planning and category management than and maybe it should have been more important in the past, but okay, well, it wasn't, but now it is. And we're reminded why now. Yeah,
I agree. And I think, look, I think that's natural. Events like these, particularly an event like this, because we really haven't had anything of this magnitude before, really reorients thinking. And I think we're probably going to be dealing with some of the, there's sort of I've always had this view of, when something happens, we change the way we think, and then over time we sort of dissipate back, right, to whatever the prior state was, and we sort of get used to it. But in this one, I feel like that residual tail, if you will, is going to be a much longer drawn out thing, because, I mean, none of us are old enough to have dealt with anything like this, unless, we were in our primes back in the early 1900s. So certainly pretty material. Scott, your thoughts?
Omer, I'd like to really focus on the people side. I think I remember years ago I read that in the time of a crisis, some people will run away, many people freeze. They don't know what to do, and a few people run in to help. And I think our obligation, what it's highlighted, is we have an obligation to run in, right, and to lead, and not point fingers, not explain why something can't be done, but it's really to shape the narrative. And so, as I think our roles, it's really highlighted the need in a time of a crisis to have that maturity, the professionalism, to operate at every level. Because in a crisis, people are looking for help. What do we do? How do we manage this? And so, we talk a lot about suppliers and network, but I think back to the beginnings of COVID and employee safety, and for us as a food manufacturer, you have people in close proximity to each other. We needed to take extraordinary efforts right away to safeguard our employees. And I think back of the efforts on mobilizing to figure out what face shields could be used, what met all requirements, how would we get them, literally how many prototypes did we do in a week to get them produced in the US from China, and using people on the ground from different places to be able to evaluate. And we were never mobilized to set up to do something like that. And so, but it's like our obligation and our teams to have that, we got this, we can figure this out. And, I've been awestruck by, in our company and every company, how we have come together to address this. And, and practically we're not completely through it. So, all of us, I think, in the supply chain, and we look at the results of the poll, that resilience that's still needed. And so those are the people elements that come to mind for me.
Yeah. That resonates so strongly. I mean, look, I think we can all, it's clear over the last, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, but even more broadly, let's say in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been tremendous advancements in terms of the tools that we have at our disposal, right? The technologies that are there, the thinking around how we do what we do, the use of analytics, the use of intelligence, all of these different things have really evolved materially over the last 2 decades. But at the end of the day, one of the thing that has struck me the most about how procurement has changed since the 90s is the quality of people working in it. And that's clearly improved. The caliber, the quality of individuals, the credentials of the individuals, not to go to credentials as the thing, but just the caliber of individual, right? The people, softer skills and all those things. But this last year has shown those people who's running in. I love that. I love that phrase. I may steal that, Scott. But I love that phrase. Who's running in? And I think that is got to be the ultimate interview criteria, right? Is this somebody who will run into the fire with me, so to speak, versus freeze and or walk away? And I think that those are the folks that we need. At the end of the day, if we have people like that, no matter what the surrounding structural elements are, the technology, things will get done, right? And I think that's a great point. So great points there. Let's go to our second poll question. I want to be mindful of our time as well. We have about a little over 20 minutes left, but the last two sections are going to talk about preparing for future crises. We talked about lessons learned and some of the prerequisites, but we're going to close off by talking about future crises. We're going to talk about implications for procurement more broadly post the pandemic in terms of how the practitioner should be thinking about it. But before we do that, to set the stage for it, let's put up the next poll question, number 2, which is, what is the biggest obstacle to putting an effective risk program in place? Is it a lack of defined strategy and scope? Is it a lack of defined process and approach? Is it access to the right technology? Is it visibility around risk metrics, visibility and communications? Or is it we're doing all of those things, we've got all of those things, but it's an inability to translate those identified risks into practical action, something we do something about. So if you could pick one of those options, it'd be good to see where people tend to settle. We'll give everybody just a few seconds to fill out that polling question.
Yeah, system only lets you choose one this time, so it's nice and straightforward.
I'm a little disappointed that the host and the panelists can't vote, though.
I know, yeah, gosh. So we can't influence it.
Yeah, that's right. We'll just give everybody a few seconds. Andrew, whenever you see a good critical mass, let's see the results. Okay.
Ooh.
Interesting. This is a little different from what I expected.
Yes.
It'd be good to get the panelist perspective. Inability to translate identified risks into actions. That's 40%, almost half of the group here, followed by a lack of defined process and approach. Okay, yeah, but almost a quarter of folks there. Followed by no defined strategy and scope or adequate visibility. Technology is not the issue. I actually agree with that point. I don't think that the tech is the issue. I think it's some of those other more foundational aspects. Scott, Steve, Graham, does that resonate with what you're hearing?
For me, the inability to actually make the change resonates a lot with me. When you have a regulated product like we're making, we don't necessarily have great flexibility to change from a sub-supplier standpoint or maybe an actual ingredient standpoint very quickly. We can, but it's something that takes time, it takes work, it takes testing in an environment where we don't have time. So for me, yes, highlighting, it's one thing to be able to highlight the risk. It's a total other thing, depending on what you're talking about, to be able to actually do something about it. And I could take another example like PPE. Yeah, we all highlighted that nobody could get PPE, but what exactly can you do about it? Right? Nobody could do much about it. And we're all in the same boat on that. So I understand that frustration.
Yeah. Scott, your thoughts? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it absolutely does. In fact, I'm surprised by that response, but not. I think it points to kind of the awareness of everyone who's part of this webinar today. Because as I think about it, translating the inability to act, because a lot of those actions that need to be taken might feel to be in conflict with what we would normally do. It might be a broader supplier diversification instead of a consolidation. It might making geographic changes of where product comes from that may be disruptive in terms of a supply chain model. It could fundamentally increase the cost structure, because as one of the challenges we've all faced as especially here in the US as we've become so incredibly efficient with just in time, the ability, no waste, lean environment means there's no inventory, there's no flex. And so you figure activating some of these programs drives costs to the machine for all of us. And so, I won't jump to solutions yet, but I think I fully agree with this being highlighted as a challenge.
Interesting. Graham?
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit disappointed that it was so high. To me, that doesn't reflect certainly what I'm seeing in terms of, in general, that ability. I mean, as we're talking about like total cost and those sort of ways of procurement communicating to the business what it needs to do. I don't know. I would have hoped it wasn't as high, and that generally procurement has been recognised that when it says we either got to pay more, or we got to use a different shipping company, or we got to do something different to reduce risk, that actually that would be adopted more readily by the business. Maybe we've still got some work to do on it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just thinking about that, and if we removed that last one, I think that translating risks into actions, the remaining responses would then tend to veer, I would guess, back towards a lack of strategy and scope, or a lack of process, not the technology piece of it, which is interesting. And that part of it certainly resonates with me in terms of a lot of what I've heard, because there's been a lot of questions in the conversations that I've had, and my team's had, around what do we do? How do we tackle this? How do we sort of get our arms around the topic of risk in terms of where we're trying to go? But that's the whole point of poll questions. It's good to get that point of view.
Yeah.
I think you're gonna say something there?
Well, I was thinking something that brings it to life as an example, what can happen, and I'll use the earthquake example again, is a best practice is to develop an alternative site for your staff outside of an earthquake zone. And you identify the people who will migrate to that site to run the company. That means you need to have dedicated real estate, space, technology, process, all set to go that's completely unused and hopefully never gets used. So as we think about, our obligation from a procurement perspective would be, how do we identify that risk and activate and enable? That's a very costly choice for a company to make. In my past, we did that. We had that infrastructure. We had a complete rollover location to manage the business. But that's one where it could show up in a PowerPoint as a critical risk, but making that conscious choice to do it, it may be hard to do financially.
I'd say that's a rarity that it would happen, right? And because it's one thing to make a decision now when we're coming off of what we're just coming off of. It's another thing when you're at the height of booming economies and everything's going great. The prominence isn't there. But I think that's a great example. It's a hard choice. It's the right choice, but it's the hard choice to make. Okay, so moving on then. I'm again conscious of time. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to try and cover off the last 2 points in just like the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. And then we can open up for any questions I think we've got a few questions. So how do we prepare? What advice would each of you give to a practitioner in terms of being better prepared for the next crisis or risk event? And Scott, maybe if you could kick us off with your thoughts around that.
I think that one is a scenario planning, is to dedicate and commit the time to identify those scenarios, not just what happens to us, but again, what happens to our supply base, because practically that will translate into a problem that we experience. So identify, risk adjust, understand what that looks like. The second would be how to prepare for it, is going back to that conference room crisis. is mobilize and go through a day in the life. What's going to happen? Who's in charge? How are we going to react? How do we wire money to a supplier somewhere else in the world we've never worked with, and we don't know if we're going to receive the product or not? How will we activate? Who can approve, control, execute? And I think the third is supply diversification, and diversification in different ways. That's around sources, pre-qualification, geography, scale. So all the things that flavors of diversification of supply base that we've maybe not really looked at before. So those are, to me, a few key things that come to mind that we need to do.
Yeah, great points, great points. And I think you touched on a few of those throughout the course of our conversation today around the conference room management, for example, and thinking more broadly about our options. Steve, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think all of it, definitely all of it does. I think this is a call to just us being more risk focused in general, whether that be, when we do category planning and looking at our supply base, really trying to not always be looking in the rearview mirror on spend, thinking about future spend. Where's the company going? What types of things are we going to need to buy? Very important in my case right now, but also something that I didn't focus on probably more as much as I should have in previous lives. I think that's really important. And then just making sure that your team really is using that lens, that risk lens, when they're thinking about what they do from a procurement standpoint, day in, day out. When we refresh category plans and all of that, I think you just need to bake it into your operation a little bit more than what we had been doing in the past.
Yeah, I can see that still being critical, even for the foreseeable future, that we have to keep doing that and beyond. Graham, does that resonate in terms of?
It does, yeah. Well, what I'd add to that is, a good number of companies have said to us that they realised that their knowledge about their suppliers was actually quite limited. And so they've been going through an exercise, not just understanding where the head office is of the supplier, but actually the individual sites where stuff is made or goods, something's done. And then not only require information about tier 1 suppliers, but actually then go down the chain. So go to tier 2 and then obligate your tier 1 supplier to do the same, thereby giving you, for those really critical items, the ability to get that information for your first 3 tiers of suppliers. And I think the other point, if I may, to add in, I would say one thing that has really helped procurement over the last year could be under the heading of supply relationship management. And I think if you're not doing that, if you're not working with your suppliers, and let's face it, most are, but identifying those suppliers, you need that special relationship, build the trust so you can have communication, so you can get the help that you need.
Great points, great. So I'll go to our final poll question, and then we'll wrap up with your quick thoughts on implication for procurement more broadly going forward, which again, I think we've touched on a lot of those themes. But the third poll question very quickly, how prepared is your organization for future crises? This is a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being completely unprepared, 10 being fully prepared. Where does everybody feel that they are as an organization? And then we'll wrap up with some final implications and some Q&A. Just give everybody 15, 20 seconds to fill that out.
And be honest.
Yeah.
It's anonymous.
It's all anonymous.
Yeah.
And Andrew, whenever you've got a good number in. Here we go. Okay. So good spread, I would say 7 out of 10 is where the majority of folks are, but a good spread, a little bit up to 8, but then a good similar number down to about 3 or 4 as well. So a good spread, I think, right around the middle, maybe a little bit past the middle. I think the last year has forced us to think a little more broadly about some of these things. All right, so we've just got 10 minutes. I'm gonna ask one final question. If we could get some implications, and Steve, I'll ask you to kick it off. What are the implications for procurement post the crisis, right? So are there any broad themes or implications for procurement, takeaways that practitioners should take away from what we've learned over the last year and where things are going?
And I've already said them already, Omer, but I'll just be really quick.
Yeah.
Be more risk focused in what we do. Understand our demand, your future demand of what you're going to be buying in more depth, and then really know your categories and your suppliers and their supply chains, I think is critical.
Yeah, makes sense. Scott?
I'm going to break the rules and say a couple things. Years ago, we had a presentation from General Schwarzkopf, and he had this fantastic line when he talked about his career. And he said, when given the ball, run with it. And the second thing was do the right thing. And if you don't know what that is, go figure it out. And so I think our obligations are to lead, not follow. We need to shape our future, not be a victim of it. And we need to operate at the board level of our companies. We need to be able to demand that support because we've earned it, because we're executing flawlessly in the support of the business and our people.
Yeah, it's fantastic. That's great. And that last couple of points around lead, not follow, operate at the board level. I think procurement has the opportunity to be far more involved than ever before. I think there's a greater recognition of being able to bring that together. Graham, closing thoughts from you on that?
I mean, totally agree on all those points that are made. And almost procurement needs to ride on the back of all that it has achieved. I think the one I'd add in that we've not really mentioned is the value procurement can support in terms of overall company reputation. And I think that's the area of potential growth that procurement is involved, but the company is realizing, the whole reputation of the way that we're doing things. So to me, it is about communication. It's about being involved, delivering the value, which may not be cost savings, most likely not.
Yeah, just to close before we go to our questions, I think from a theme perspective, that makes a lot of sense. And, a lot of the themes that we touched on today, as I took notes, being able to anticipate, getting greater visibility, being more agile, and letting go of the work rules when you really need to, thinking about who our folks are who are going to be running in times like these, who are ready to do the right thing and lead, and then operating at the board level. There's a thing, from a SmartQ perspective, when we talk about procurement and where we're trying to take practitioners in terms of what we do from an insight perspective, the core mission, underlying mission that we have is, I always use this phrase, that we want to help procurement become the number one value creator in the organization. And I think a lot of folks, take that seriously. Not everybody takes it seriously, but some folks sort of bristle at it. Well, can procurement really be the number one? And I think that's actually true. And I think over the last year, we've seen that procurement can be a prime driver in the organization to really change things. And so I think that those points around thinking more broadly, around leading, around operating at the board level makes perfect sense. So thanks everybody for that. Any final comments for any of our esteemed panelists?
Well, you know what? I know I shouldn't butt in, but I think we should also be aware. Anyone wants to learn even more than this, then someone has got a new book out. Omer and his colleague Subhash Chandar have got a book, and make sure I get the title right. It's called Risk and Your Supply Chain, Preparing for the Next Global Crisis. It's available on Amazon. Check it out, but it's definitely something that is worth a good read.
Well, thanks for that plug. The check's in the mail, Graham. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Scott, Steve, Graham, thanks for taking time out of your morning. Thanks to everybody who attended. Appreciate your time and take care.